is Mary Lee Fulkerson, and I'm a member of the Nevada Women's History Project. Today is August 16, 2017. We are interviewing Barbara Cavanaugh Thornton, a woman ahead of her time. This interview is part of a project to interview women of Nevada, thanks to a grant from the Robert Z Hawkins Foundation. Let's talk about your beginnings. Were you born in Tonopah? I know you've mentioned it, and I love your Tonopah stories.
Born in Tonopah, Nevada, from parents who lived there and loved Tonopah and never wanted to move. They did eventually. John Cavanaugh was my father, and Marjorie Mullen Cavanaugh was my mother. M-U-L-L-E-N. Living in Tonopah was fascinating. 2,500 people lived there. No TVs, no fancy kind of things. As kids, we spent our time walking and running and dealing with nature. Spent most of our time outside. And my mother was very instrumental in getting activities going for the students. For the kids. And my father went from being a man who supported 7 kids and his mother at $1 a day at a grocery store in Tonopah. And he went from that to be very successful, oil manager, owned a car place in Tonopah. And they were a very good team in trying to make Tonopah better and kids happier. His father had been a man who'd come to Tonopah to make a lot of money in the mines, and instead had lost everything and died of black lung disease. So Dad had to take over and raise the family and take care of his wonderful mother.
And you had just one brother, did you?
One brother,
yeah.
John Cavanaugh.
Okay.
And he moved to Reno when we all did. We moved to Reno because our house burned down. My dad would never have left Tonopah, Nevada, because he loved it so, but the house burned down. And you couldn't rebuild easily in Tonopah because you couldn't get supplies to rebuild. And my mother, who loved Tonopah, also loved Reno and was very happy to move to Reno.
Okay, before we get to Reno, tell me about the water situation in Tonopah.
Oh, goodness. Tonopah is noted for that. Tonopah was run by a private company who did not ever take care of the water or make it better or more frequent, etc. So water dripped into our houses, and we weren't allowed to take a bath unless we had just an inch of water, and that could only be done once or twice a week because Tonopah was that short of water. So when Dad was very active in the Democratic Party, and when they'd come from Las Vegas to Reno, they'd end up in Tonopah, Midway, Nevada. And he would tell them to be very careful of water in the bathroom. Tonopah was noted for not having water till it was bought by a water company later on.
I'll bet you loved those baths after you got to Reno.
Oh, I'll never forget my first bath in Reno with a real inch or two of water. But it was a special place in many ways because it really was true outdoor Nevada. And it was rough and it was fun because we had to make up our own games. School was a little difficult because they had a hard time having teachers who'd stay in Tonopah, Nevada for more than a year. It was pretty empty for people who were looking for mates and things like that. So we learned fast. That's why I finally left Tonopah and went to San Francisco College for Women for a year. I hadn't graduated from high school. But I left because it was either that or marry my boyfriend, who was not really who I needed to marry. So went to San Francisco College for Women, and very different experience than Tonopah, Nevada, but I learned a great deal and got to be in the city where I had to wear white gloves. Tonopah, Nevada didn't even know what white gloves were, and I'm not putting down Tonopah, but we didn't have to wear them. And so it was very interesting to be in San Francisco. Miss Tonopah learned a great deal because the college was run by Catholic nuns who had gotten their PhD degrees and were really well educated about most everything. So I learned, well, not everything, but I learned a great deal from them. I had applied to several good colleges, and the phone rang, and my house had burned down, not with the family, the dog and cat in it, which is heartbreaking, but the house burned down. And in Tonopah, Nevada, you don't replace. It just would have been too hard to replace. And I think my mother wanted to go to Reno anyway. So my dad, rather reluctantly, took us to Reno. We moved to Reno, and I started at UNR. See, 1954 maybe?
Yeah. Okay.
Might have been a little earlier than that.
Yeah, when not a lot of women were going to college.
No, they weren't. And they weren't going to law school. The reason I was going to law school was because when I was 8 years old, I got to vote for president in Tonopah, Nevada. Now, before you believe that story, though it's a true one, what happened in Tonopah was they'd have the kids vote at school the day before the election. And then they'd know ahead of time who was going to win the elections. They could make predictions and choose a different way of voting. So I got to vote. And I was so inspired about that, about politics. My dad would have loved it if I'd become a lawyer. So I tried. I started that way.
So that was your major in college?
Well, yes, it was. It was. And I went to UNR, had a wonderful time. Maybe too good a time, I think those of us who went to UNR said.
Well,
My grades were not as high as they were at the San Francisco College for Women.
Well, I'll tell you, I was there when you were
Yes.
there. I don't know that we knew each other that well, but you ran for a particular office there. Do you remember that?
Yes, you could not run for president of UNR. That was only a boy job. But you could be president for the women's group, and I did that. I ran, and I won, but it was very important to me even then about women's issues, which is why I did that. I was waking up to women's losses and gains. It's scary to do something like that, yeah, but it was good. I met wonderful people. Yeah, UNR taught me a lot, but there was so much prejudice against women. The startling story for me was there was an old history teacher there who everyone knew. He wasn't around much because he drank a lot, but you don't get fired for things like that. So my best friend, Sue Thompson, the gal who's now in California, and I decided to play a game. He had a two-semester class, and we went to the first class and worked very hard to get good grades, very hard, and we got B's. And we went, I'm almost ashamed to tell the story, but we went back for the second semester, sat in the first row, raised our dresses just a little, and got A's, and only worked half as hard. But that was a good example. It's funny, but it's a good example of the kind of thing that happened to women even then.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah. But we made some progresses. We could stay up later than we thought we could at the sorority houses, and there was some just beginning focus of women's issues. Mm-hmm. Because even then, it was fine to graduate, but the important thing was to find a man to marry.
Yeah, that was my major.
Well, most women felt that way. My dad was still after me to become an attorney, so when one of my boyfriends left for the service, I decided I would go. I did some work first. I was an investigator for a company that investigated people, but before you're impressed with that, I was an investigator because the investigator was the typist for the company that had the exciting experiences going out. So then I came back here for a while because I wanted to wait a little longer for law school, and I was hired by the company that, of course, ran the telephones. I forgot what did we call that then, but anyhow, I was hired to be their demonstrator throughout the state of the products that they. And that was fun because I got to meet a lot of people. It was exciting to do that. But then I decided law school was really where I wanted to go. And so I went back to Washington, D.C., and I was admitted to Georgetown University, which was a big deal because they had very little women. But before we make me too grand, what they did, of course, was succumb to political pressure. And one of the senators from Nevada urged them to admit me, and they did. I was one woman among 250 men.
Wow.
It was not fun. I kind of liked the law part, but even then I found out a shocking thing, which was when I was called upon, I did know the answer to a question, but I was afraid to say it out loud to 250 guys. Mm-hmm. You look back on that now, and I'm so shocked but I understand why I felt the way. Yeah, it was. And the other funny thing that happened is the day we were admitted to law school, we had to stand up when the head guy came, and it was the day of very short skirts, but you had to wear slips under the skirts. You also had to have on a girdle all the time when you worked, and even at this class you had to wear on a girdle, and what do we call those things that keep us tight? Anyhow, you had to have all that on. And so I'm standing up, and it's real hot. We're saying hi to the new head of the school, and my slip falls off. Oh. Luckily, I was standing there, but it was an awful experience to lose your slip in front of 250 men. But hopefully they were busy looking at the dean. So it was just little things like that. The men paid very little attention to me in class, but I got a lot of phone calls about going out at night. And I just felt very inappropriate there. And besides, I decided I didn't really want to be a lawyer. I studied hard, I was doing fine, but I didn't want to be a lawyer. So in about that time, I was dating Bill Thornton, who was from Nevada, and we decided to get married. So,
was he living in Washington then?
No, he went to law school in Arizona. Oh, okay. But he moved to Washington, wanted to move back to Washington after we got married, so we did, and my job was wonderful. I got hired by one of the Nevada senators. I was a lousy typist. I didn't do well at all with writing anything. But I was pretty good at politics and meeting people and getting around, so I worked for Howard Cannon for 2 years. And part of that, which was pretty wonderful, is that it was during, for me, John Kennedy was running for office. Okay. And I met him in Reno, Nevada, and thought, as most women did, how wonderful he was. But Cannon had lots to say about Democratic politics. And so they gave their staff members away to the campaigns. So I was given to Kennedy's campaign, and it was incredible. It was the national office, and you just had to do all sorts of crazy, wonderful things. Kennedy family wasn't around too much, but it was still wonderful to be part of that. And at the end, the last day, most of the staff went to where Kennedy was, but Bill was studying for a law exam, and so I stayed, and I was head of the whole thing for one night. The night. That's not a very big deal, but it was fun. It was fun. But then I was offered a job by the Kennedy administration, and I did that after we had the inaugural, and I was in charge of the inaugural for Nevada. Oh. And one of the funny things there is that they needed someone who looked like Kennedy to be on a float. I had to get all these tickets for Nevada. It was the first time a Democrat had been in ages. I had to give my soul for tickets, etc. And finally, the guy who was in charge said, "Your husband looks like John Kennedy." So if you'll get him to be on the float as a freshman, Kennedy was playing football, then you can have your tickets. So but the ironic part about that was Bill was studying for an exam, couldn't go to the inauguration, which was it snowed that day, and Washington, D.C. was a mess. And all these women had bought these gorgeous, wonderful dresses. And underneath were the rubber boots we all wear. You know, flat rubber boots, because that's the only thing you could do to get through the snow. So that was all great. And then we came back, and that was a little hard for me to come back. He decided we were going to come back to Reno. And I say that gently because that's what you're supposed to do, follow your man, right? Yep. Didn't occur to me that I might have argued a little more. It was just that it wasn't Bill's fault or anything, it was just the way things were done then. So back we were, and so I decided when we came back, it was so hard to make that change, as much as I loved Reno, so I decided I'd be a meter Molly, because I could be outside after being at a desk. Well, that didn't go too far. So once I stabilized myself, I went back to the university because one of my professors told me I'd be a good teacher. So I went back, got a master's, had a baby, finished my master's, had another baby, and then by that time we are really having the women's revolution, exactly right. Even in Reno, Nevada. That's right. That's right. So I figured out this weird plan, which no one approved of, friends, family. Bill did, he was a good sport about this, that he would watch the kids, or take care of the kids while I was but I'd have to go away to get my PhD, and because this still is before law school, and I decided by this time not to go to law school, really, to teach. And so we had to figure out logistics, because I couldn't get my degree in the state of Nevada. You weren't allowed then to teach at the university if you had gotten all your other degrees. And I think that makes sense. It was very hard on us, but it made sense that you have to know something other than just what you have at your own school. So, did that.
You moved to Utah?
No, well, at first I got my master's degree, but I think I said that. Yeah. No, couldn't move to Utah. I wouldn't leave my kids like that. But it was very cheap to communicate, to fly from Reno to Salt Lake. And so I would fly for classes once every 2 weeks and be home. And then I kept my youngest child with me, because the people in Utah were so good about childcare and things like that. So the younger, and I wanted to keep the older, but Bill wouldn't let both kids go. My son, one son was Brett, and the other son was Dan.
Okay, and you took Dan with you?
I took Dan with me, because he was only about 5 at the time and didn't feel he should be away from his mother. And again, they have such good conditions at the University of Utah that they had a play yard and classes and all those things right out the door practically. Wasn't easy, but it was possible, and I met so many wonderful people. I wanted to do something like this, and women just started doing these things. We weren't supposed to do all this stuff. And both Bill and I got a lot of criticism for doing this because we weren't with the children full time, particularly me. But it worked. So, and then I got my degree in health and communication, health communication. And
you chose health and communications.
Well, communication was always my issue. The part I forgot about was just before, while I was I really worked hard here for the in the Democratic Party. And really it wasn't party, we were trying to help Republican women too, because women could not be the head of the party. They couldn't vote for the candidates for president, they couldn't do anything. They chose the men that were in office to be the delegates and to have all those important positions. So at that point, Nancy Gomes and Nancy was a wonderful woman. I don't know if any of you knew her, but she was incredible. And we decided that we had to fight the system and get women included in all these things. And so we did, we won. And we sent women to the National Party things, and from then on women started working, because they were doing all the work anyway.
No, they were doing all the work.
The men did collect the money, but they were doing the work. And I don't mean to put men down, it was the system at that point. And so, anyhow, when I got back from Utah, I had to find a job, wanted to teach, and there was a grant at the university. Again, Bill wanted to stay here with his law practice, don't blame him, and so I couldn't look at jobs other places. One of my desires is to get people working in teams, and that was one of the things Nancy and I did when we tried to get things changed. And I wanted to see health teams. They just began talking about health teams and how people, doctors, nurses, etc., could work together. And so we got money to get a grant. And the grant provided for us at medical school, new medical school, to...
Oh, there was the medical school was there then.
Yes, it was only 2 years old, but it was there, barely there.
Yeah.
And we got a grant to form teams, and I studied them. I did the research on how they operated and things. It was wonderful. That's how that was finally the final thing I had to do to finish my PhD, was my dissertation.
So it was a grant
to start healthcare teams. Even in that, and we're talking then, what are we talking, the late 70s probably. Until that time, healthcare people worked separately from each other. They never knew what each other was doing. And we started a grant saying it works lots better if you can get a nurse, a doctor, everyone together.
So were you employed, did that on a grant, you weren't employed?
At that point I wasn't with the university, I was on that grant. Okay. When the grant was over, I was hired by the university to be a professor in a department we were calling health sciences, I think. At the time we changed our name several times.
I know, it's changed a lot.
And that's where I got trained even more in ethics. And because ethics was needed so much in a medical facility. And so, and nationally, they were just starting the ethics in medicine and healthcare kinds of programs. So we got through that project. They hired me in this department. And that's when I started having a lot of fun about the women's issues, because there was a chance to do things and to encourage women. Women weren't encouraged to go to medical school. And we were able to help that. We were able to give them communication techniques and and men too, because I love women, but those guys were pretty impelling and studying and concentrating and didn't get sidetracked as many women did. But that was also important, is to teach gals how not to be sidetracked. And so that was what I did for 30 years essentially, and built a center with other people for ethics and healthcare. The center was for the state of Nevada. We got a huge grant to have this center to work particularly on death and dying and other healthcare issues. And we ran it throughout the state. It was magnificently successful. Hospitals loved us, and the university closed us down when they ran out of money during that bad part. Scientists, I think, had more attention than did medical ethics. But, you know, that was life, and we did a good job all the 10 years where we were in business. And students began to be interested in ethics. They really were. At that point, they started having students answer ethical questions when they were interviewed for medical school. So I did that, had a good time doing it. Women's issues always came up then because women were beginning to become alive, knowing that they could do things. That's what I mean by becoming alive. Yeah, and but it's interesting because even then there was a prejudice for me in this case. I was working so hard to get women to be apply for law school, know they could become doctors, nurses, or whatever they wanted. But I noticed after a year or two of teaching, and I had some wonderful ethics classes, I noticed that I was only, when they'd raise their hand, calling on the men. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it fascinated me, and of course I corrected as soon as I knew, but just the habit. Men talk louder, they are there. Women have to learn to do those things. We don't want to put men down, we just want to teach them how to do those things. And they began to enter the field. And we taught, our program taught lawyers too. Some of the lawyers took the ethics courses, and nurses. We loved having the nurses around. When we did the team grant, we did it with doctors and nurses and physical therapists and whatever. And then the nursing school decided they didn't want to be taught by the doctors, etc. So that team idea didn't work, though they're trying it again now.
Well, so were you a full professor by this?
Yeah, I was. And I was chosen to be the distinguished professor in 1907 of the university. 1907. I don't think that was, 2007 might have done it.
Wow.
I was very grateful because I was treated very well for someone who opened her mouth a lot. Frankie Sue Del Papa, who was at that time, I think, Attorney General or Secretary of State, and I decided something had to be done about talking about death and dying in Nevada, because it was behind closed doors. And people were having terrible experiences, not knowing what to do with their patients who were dying, family members. So we asked the governor to set up a commission where we could look at death and dying and open this issue to the public. And we did. We had several meetings, came up with a report for the governor, and decided that was enough. But they wouldn't let us disband our members, who by that time, they were suspicious at first, but we were so careful about not crossing religious lines or political lines. And so we continued. And then out of that, we got a grant for almost $1 million from the Johnson Foundation to do death and dying work. That had happened throughout the country also at other places. So, but we got one of the 3 top grants, and we decided to service the state of Nevada, which was probably not a good idea, and we did. We went out to the small counties. We had all sorts of conventions and things. We talked to the small counties on the, over the internet when we found out little things like, of course, they can't come to Reno for a conference because they have no one to replace them in some of the smaller issues. So anyhow, we did that, and we were well received by the medical community, which was a good thing. We could do continuing education courses on death and dying. And people would call us, they knew enough about it to call and ask for advice with their patient or their family member. But the university did not want to sponsor, we weren't a money-making part of the university, and so they didn't want to sponsor during that bad time of money. They didn't want to keep things open that were like ours. They only wanted classes.
You've met with a lot of obstacles, and you just keep going, and look at kind of like water eddying over rocks. You just keep going.
Everybody does that. Most people.
This Nevada Center Ethics and Health Policy.
Well, that was what we're talking about.
Okay.
This center we got the grant for.
Oh, and so you opened that. So
we did. Mm-hmm.
Congratulations.
Yeah, we used the money to do that, and we served Las Vegas. It was a wonderful time to work with Las Vegas people and small counties. At that time in Nevada, no one was talking about death and dying or making it easier for family members or the patient themselves. And so all we wanted to do is talk about that, get death out in the open so people could talk about it with friends, relatives, and healthcare providers. And that's what we did.
Was Nevada any different than the rest of the country?
Of course not. And that's why we were one of the states, one of the top 3 states, to get a grant so people would begin talking about these issues. And we were very lucky to get that grant that was large enough to allow us to open a center and have those discussions. And I want to add that we weren't discussing what we do now, giving medication at the end of life. We weren't discussing those things. We were just discussing the process and what you could do and how families could become more comfortable and how the patient could become more comfortable. And people were very interested in that. We put on programs throughout the state that were very well attended because people wanted to talk about death and dying. They just didn't have a platform.
Of all these things that you accomplished in your professional life, what was the thing that you are proudest of?
Just to the fact that we got people interested in medical ethics, and particularly that we got women involved because it was time.
Yeah. Okay, that's so great. So I think you haven't mentioned your awards.
Oh.
Now you were just. I was shocked when I saw that you were named a distinguished Nevadan. Would you repeat that?
Oh, there's nothing to say about it. It was nice of them to give us that. Give me one. That Bill got a distinguished event. We've done a lot of work outside of what we've talked about here, you know, in the community and organizations and other things, and so they give us credit for that.
For other work like the...
Oh, things Thornton in the community and Thornton Peace Prize.
Oh, what's that?
We went through all that, yeah, during the terrible time when Vietnam and all of those things were happening. People were getting killed then too. And we established a Peace Prize at the university because they had had a demonstration, not as ugly as Charlottetown, but we needed to get people looking at peace instead of war. So we give that prize. And then we give a prize for, I give a prize for civic contribution at the university. So.
Wonderful.
Well,
that's still going on.
Mm-hmm, both are.
Yeah.
They will continue after we don't.
You've won many other awards. You want to read them off?
No, no, not at all. The whole thing is that for all of us, when we're trying to make the community better, it's the kind of thing we need to be talking about today. What can we do to talk together, work together? That's what we're doing, and I was doing particularly with healthcare. How do we get people to work together? All right.
I just wanted to ask you who some of your mentors were or role models?
Oh, it was so hard to find role models then in some of these things we were doing, because when we first started all these things, not when we were at the university, but the early part, there just weren't women doing anything. Women weren't supposed to go to college, or well, they could go to college to get a boyfriend, or husband, but they weren't encouraged to get jobs or do other things. So it was very important, we thought, to do that. You have to have female mentors, role models, and at the university was very bleak of role models. And Howard was one of the first teachers up there. There were some other women, but Dean Mobley was not a teacher, but certainly helped the women to keep going. So, and then had other women in my life. But we had a wonderful woman in Nevada who was 91 years old, who was born in Belmont, and was the first baby born in Belmont. And she ended up going to the Historical Society and doing research. So she was being treated at UR just like a faculty member. And she was a role model, because here she is, 91, doing research. That's what I thought I wanted to do and why I decided I wanted to be a professor. So there's that woman out there. And then there were more. Nada Novakovich was one of the first women lawyers in Nevada. And there were a few other people like that that were there for those of us who wanted to try some things.
What about books or readings or videos or anything like that?
Oh, all the women's literature I was certainly reading at the time. too many books to mention, but I read everything that came out in terms of women's issues and political issues, making the country great and common sense and those kind of things. And now I read a lot of meditation kinds of things. I think that kind of keeps you grounded.
Yeah.
At least for me it does.
And I know that according to this, you're still have your work, your business that you're running. So.
I have, and I'm raising 2 teenagers. Two of my grandchildren. I have 4 wonderful grandchildren, and 2 of them live with me. And
what are their names?
Mick Thornton, Michelange, and Kitty Thornton, Catherine Thornton, and Stella Thornton, and Sean Thornton. 2 in Carson and 2 in Reno.
And you're raising the teenagers.
The 2 teenagers, yeah. So it's very interesting, learning a great deal from raising teenagers.
Well, that leads me to my next question. And when I did my book, I'm not going to ask you this, but I asked the artist, in praise of failure, what made you strong? But the next question it came with was what transformative experiences in your life brought you through? Were there transformative experiences? And I know that takes some thinking. But
There were some. When you see some woman who became effective and acknowledged, when more women could go to law school or medical school or any school they wanted, all of those things were very important. They were transformed. Well, when you saw some of these things happen, it was transformative. When you saw more and more women and men learning together to do things. The other part of my teaching was about communication and good communication, which has so much to do with ethics. So I think that is the most important thing we can be teaching. And I always added that in my class, and sometimes that worked very well. And sometimes, as we know, women have a lot to learn still about communication. We talk about all these higher-ups not getting jobs, women, but we have to learn to advocate for ourselves. And if we fail, start again.
Okay, well, you got ahead of me by a question.
Sorry about that.
Good. But what have you learned from your life experiences, both failures and successes? Is there some kind of a broad thinking or you're taking meditation now,
Meditation, not medication.
Meditation.
I've learned a lot. I've become a lot more mellow, and I've learned to pat myself on the back and not to be mad at myself. That's the biggest thing that's happened to me. But to forgive myself and to forgive others and to get over holding grudges. And I think that's just the most important thing we need to do for our world as well as our personal homes, places.
And then the last question is, you started with it, but what message would you have for young women?
The first message I'd have for everyone, women and men, is just to be curious. Instead of to hold beliefs and strong beliefs without developing them in a reasonable way, just to be curious. Curious about other people, curious about what you want to do. And I think that's the most important thing we can do. I'm sending this young man off to college, and that's my goal for him. Be curious and be thoughtful. And to learn how to communicate so that you're not angry, you can deliver your message. For men and women, I think that's so important. Another thing I'd like to note is the importance of men in our lives. Those of us who have worked for women's issues tend sometime to forget that many men along the way have helped us. My brother John Kavanaugh has been helpful and very supportive of women, and my ex-husband Bill Thornton has also been important in those issues. Right now, I want to mention particularly my family members. My grandchildren, Mick, Kitty, and Sean, and Stella, are introducing me to all the new thoughts of this generation, and that is very helpful. My sons Dan and Brett have also played an important part in my life. Dan is my partner now in business. I want to thank particularly the Women's History Project for doing this, and as I do that, I think about the origins of the Nevada Women's Fund, because when we started it, Maya Miller, who was a great activist, and Frankie Sue and I decided something had to be done for women because it was already being done by men. So we brought together this little project, and Jen Evans was our first head of it. And we stumbled along, and it worked. But then along came Fritzy and Lynn, and boy did it work then. They came up with a model that really worked, and it's worked ever since, and has grown ever since, and look at y'all now. Your project is a part of the Women's Fund. There are so many other things that are coming out of it. Women are doing such good work. So I just really want to end with that, because I think it's so important to give credit where credit's due. Thank you so much for interviewing me, old friend.
You're welcome, and I thank you back again.